Marian listened and closed her eyes in terror. She could not mistake her stepmother's footsteps for anything else. For months, Pamela had not even made an attempt to hide her true identity. As soon as Marian was brought home from the hospital, Pamela began wishing her a speedy death and hinting that she would do anything to make it happen. At first, Marian couldn't believe Pamela was really saying that, but as time went by, the girl became convinced that she was really hindering Pamela because there was a lot of money at stake. And yet not long ago, Marian's life was happy and serene. She did not need anything. She studied at the university and loved her father unconditionally. Despite her status, she was not spoiled like many of her friends, and her father was very proud of her. When Marian turned 18, he introduced her to Pamela. Marian understood that her father had done a great deed by not getting married all that time. So she tried to treat Pamela kindly, though she did not like her at all. The woman looked beautiful and well-groomed and behaved politely, but her eyes almost always remained cold and indifferent. Unfortunately, only Marian noticed that. Her father was head over heels in love. Marian and Pamela kept neutral with each other, talking politely and trying not to cross each other's paths. Seeing that his beloved women were getting along quite well, Mr. Bennet made up his mind and proposed to Pamela. On the very day when it all happened, Marian came home to please her father that she had gotten her driver's license. Upon entering the house, Marian saw a quarrel between him and Pamela. When she asked what happened, her father evasively said that it was just the cost of family life and nothing more. He did not want to tell his daughter that he and Pamela had quarreled because she had demanded to be included in the will. And in order to secure her future, she wanted nothing less than 50% of his company. But Mr. Bennet made it clear that the company would belong only to his daughter, and he had already sealed her right to it in his will. Pamela's reaction stunned him. He thought for the first time that he may have rushed into marriage, but he decided to revisit the subject later. For now, his beloved daughter was so happy and he didn't want to spoil her mood. Marian and her father got into her beautiful new red car, a birthday present, and drove out of the city. Mr. Bennet admiringly watched how well his daughter drove the car. Suddenly, a truck appeared out of nowhere and swerved towards them from behind a curve. Marian immediately reacted and sharply pressed the pedal, but it failed and the speed did not decrease. Her father realized what was happening and grabbed the steering wheel, twisting it so that his side of the car took the impact. He was killed instantly and Marian was left bedridden. So now, the door of the room opened and Pamela walked in. As usual, the stepmother had come to pour out her anger on Marian once again, wishing her a speedy death before taking inheritance rights. But today she was smiling wickedly, and Marian realized that Pamela was up to something terrible. And she wasn't wrong. You know, dear, I've been thinking a little. It's very hard for someone like you to be in the city. So today you're moving to a country cottage. I fired your nurse, but don't worry. I found you a new one and he will take care of you as you deserve it, said Pamela vindictively, looking into Marian's frightened eyes as she continued. His name is Kurt, and he was in prison for 5 years for murder. He was released a day ago and hasn't had any contact with women for a long time. So I congratulate you. Soon you'll want to go to your father. Pamela smiled triumphantly and left the room, and Marian stared blankly at the ceiling for several more hours until the hired man came for her. Once in the country house, the young woman really wanted to cry because she used to love this place, but now she felt that it would be her last shelter. Pamela noted with mocking tones in her voice that here in such a quiet, beautiful place, nobody could hear her, and then went out. Marian only heard her talking to a man behind the door. A day ago, Kurt couldn't believe his luck. He got out of jail and didn't know where to go. His apartment had been sold as part of the damages, and he could not turn to his acquaintances, as he was sure that no one would communicate with him now. He was squatting outside the store when a fancy car stopped next to him, and a gorgeous woman of about 35 got out. She was looking at him with interest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a 2-week beard and a bald head, wearing clothes that had gone out of fashion many years ago. She immediately determined that he had just been released from prison and asked what he was in for. Kurt did not want to talk, but when the woman hinted that she would pay him money if he told her, he admitted that he had been in prison for murder. Surprisingly, the woman was very happy with the answer. She said there was a job for him, and since in his position it would be foolish to refuse, he agreed. When he arrived at the place, he realized that they obviously did not count money, but why they needed an ex-convict was still a mystery. He cautiously entered the room and saw the frightened young woman lying on the bed. Marion squeezed her eyes shut and prepared for the worst, but nothing happened. The man just stood there with his arms crossed and looked at her. Then he introduced himself and asked if she could only lie down or sit up as well. Marion quietly said she didn't know, but her stepmother said she could only lie down and forbade anyone from helping her sit down. After those words, the man offered Marion something to eat. She was surprised and thought that his tactic was to tame his victim first. But deciding that it was better to eat, she nodded. Kurt handed her the TV remote and went into the kitchen. Marion was distracted by the show and even forgot for a while why she had been brought here. When Kurt entered, she shuddered and saw that he had rolled up a table with delicious and fragrant food to her bedside. When the man held out his hands to her, Marion screamed in such a way that Kurt recoiled, thinking that he had accidentally hurt her. Hearing from him that he just wanted to help her sit up, Marion felt a little ashamed of her tantrum. She let Kurt comfortably sit her down and realized how much she missed being able to observe life from a normal angle. After they ate a hearty meal, Kurt sat down in the chair across from her and offered to tell her what had happened and why she was so displeased with the gorgeous woman who had brought her here. Marion did not understand why, but she told him everything from beginning to end. And so Kurt finally understood what Pamela was hinting at and what she expected from him. He calmed Marion down by saying that she should not be afraid of him, and he would do exactly what he had agreed to do, which was to take care of a sick person. After wishing her good night, Kurt left the room, but at the door, he turned around and asked if she had her medical documents in the house. Marion replied that he could look for them in her father's study on the second floor and take his things if he needed to change, and also look in the pantry where her stepmother had thrown her things from the city house. In the morning, Marion woke up to the smell of coffee. She realized that for the first time in a long time, she had slept through the night peacefully. Kurt brought her coffee, and she asked if she could have some. He replied that she could, and then put a thick blue folder on the table. He had found her documents, but it took a lot of work. When Marion finished her coffee, Kurt took her to the bathroom for her morning treatment. Marion was very embarrassed, but there was no getting away from it. After Kurt helped Marion wash and change her clothes, he took her to the terrace, and they continued their conversation from the day before. "You don't look much like a murderer," Marion said thoughtfully. "I've been to jail, of course, but I'm not a murderer." Marion stared at the man in surprise, and he told her his story. Kurt worked as a surgeon and loved his profession. One day, he assisted in an operation on the son of the head doctor of the clinic. He made a fatal mistake and tried to correct it, but only made it worse for himself. The patient could not be saved, and under pressure and threats from the head doctor, all the staff who were present during the operation testified against Kurt. He was eventually imprisoned for 5 years and deprived of his right to practice medicine even after his release. Marion had no idea that Kurt had a similar unfortunate fate. Fate as she did, the man said that he worked at the hospital where Marion was treated and that he would make sure to find out what was wrong with her. 2 days later, after studying the contents of the blue folder with Marion's medical history, Kurt said that he could help her, but she had to trust him. The young woman had no choice, so she agreed. She was in pain and scared, but by following Kurt's instructions, she was able to stand up unaided and take a few steps after 2 months. Her stepmother found out that Marion was still okay and grunted disappointedly. So Kurt, who suspected that the accident was not accidental, realized that something needed to be done to protect Marion in this situation. Marion told Kurt that there was one person who could help, her father's executor and friend, Mr. James. Pamela was able to convince him that Marion was dying, Kurt went to the city and returned in the evening with Mr. James. When the man entered the room and saw Marion standing by the window, he was speechless, because he had been led to believe that Marion had not been able to get up for a long time and was dying. After listening to Marion's story, he told them to wait for his return and left. Marion was sad the whole evening. She realized that she would most likely never see Kurt again, the man who had become everything in her life. At night, she drove the wheelchair up to his room and carefully opened the door. He was awake, as if waiting for her. He just asked if she would regret it, and then gently laid her on the bed and closed the door. In the morning, Mr. James came and told them that when the police came for Pamela and informed her that the doctor who had treated Marion had been arrested and the car had been sent for examination, she immediately understood everything. Before leaving for the city, Marion asked Kurt to wait for her. Kurt smiled, but in his heart he knew that this naive young woman was unlikely to return after she had returned to her wealthy life. As they drove away, Marion turned to Mr. James and told him Kurt's story. A week went by, Marion was still gone, and Kurt didn't know what to do. Out of boredom, he turned on the TV and watched the news. Suddenly, he saw his own photo on the screen. The voiceover reported that a new investigation showed that Dr. Kurt Montgomery had been a victim of criminal manipulation by the head doctor of the clinic and his son, and that he had spent several years behind bars because of it. The management of the clinic decided to compensate him for all the years and reinstate him in his position after his certification. Reporters also told the story of the local businessman's wife, who was accused of her husband's untimely death and attempting to kill his daughter. Kurt was stunned and couldn't believe that his name was now cleared. And at that moment, Marion was already standing on the threshold of the room. With a bottle of champagne in hand and a wide smile on his face, Kurt rushed towards her and embraced her tightly. In that moment, he realized that justice and true love do exist in this world.